welcome back to release week. I'm super excited because we are only one day away from Free being out in the world. Hope on the High Seas Book 1 officially releases tomorrow, and I am so excited to share Ruth's story with you all. So today, continuing my release week series of videos about how I wrote Free, I am going to be telling you about how I did the historical research for this book and how I incorporated it into the story that I already had. So as you will know if you have been following my channel for a while, I did a video a while back on how to write and research historical fiction, and that largely came from my experience in writing the story of Free. And in that video, I broke the process down into two steps. Step 1, deciding what time period you wanted, and step 2, what to do after you've decided on a time period. So I figured that that would be a logical way to break up this video into a couple of different sections. So first I'm going to tell you about how I decided what time period I wanted Ruth's story to take place in, and then how I incorporated that research into the story that I actually by that point had already written. And I might as well be honest with you guys up front that I had already written the story before I had officially decided what time period I wanted it to take place in. At the time of me first writing the first draft of this story, which I actually still have behind me, and I will be telling you guys about the different drafts and the editing process later this week in a different video. But when I wrote that first draft, I was not yet very experienced with doing historical research for research papers or stuff like that. I had done research from like books for school papers and things like that, but I was still very new to conducting internet research, and that was something that doing this kind of research would require. So I actually had the first draft and possibly even the second draft written before I went and did true research and decided what time period I wanted the story to take place in. Even though it ended up working for me, now whenever I write stories, I like to have an idea of what time period I'm going to be writing in before I start writing them, because it does make it a little bit easier. But despite that, I'm still really happy with the finished product, and I also feel like it doesn't feel forced. Like, there were already things in the story that went in line with the time period and the setting, of course, that I chose. So it really worked a lot better than I would have expected it to if you had said, like, oh, it's just a story where they wrote a story and then decided to have it be a historical story. It wasn't jarring like that. Like, it actually worked pretty well. I just had to adjust some things to make it fit the time period that I chose. So whenever I first decided to do historical research and really figure out what time period I wanted this to take place in so that it wouldn't be so vague and so we could have a specific setting and a specific time and place that they were, I had to decide when generally in history I wanted to take place, and then specifically what century after that. So first, on the general aspect, I actually entertained the idea of it taking place in ancient times. Now, I quickly discovered that that just didn't really work with what I had already set up in the story, even though, like I mentioned in the first video for release week, that this book was originally born out of my imaginary adventures after seeing a biblical musical. I didn't end up really liking the Bible time setting for this story, just didn't really work, and so I ended up looking to more of a later European time period, and I ended up really liking that. Now, as you know, there are many, many, many centuries to choose from in Europe's history, even if you're looking at more the later European history. By later, I mean, like, I knew I didn't want it to take place in medieval times because that didn't really work with the story. One thing that was important to the story and important to my research was that, as you can see, Ruth has a physical bound copy of the Bible, and there were some centuries prior to the time period that I ended up going with where the Bible was not really accessible like that to a common person, and so I knew I needed to find a time period or find a way for Ruth to actually be able to own a Bible, and I ended up doing that by choosing a slightly later century. I ended up going with the 1600s, where it was more common for more ordinary people to actually possess a copy of the Bible. Once I knew that I wanted a later, sometime around the 1500s to 1700s time period, I had to decide which century specifically I wanted, and that was actually fairly complicated. It really came down to the ship. What kind of ship did I want, and what century did that ship occur the most in? What century was it the most common in? At what century was it at its height? So there were ships that I looked at in the earlier days of like the Golden Age of Sail, like Christopher Columbus's ships, but they were really too small, and I pictured Captain Edward's ship more like a stereotypical pirate ship. I needed it to be a little bit smaller than your average pirate ship because I wanted the crew to be fairly small, because I felt like if I had like 100-man crew, it would lose some of the personal aspect of the story. Like, you don't necessarily meet every single sailor on the crew in the story. But at least there's not like a sea of nameless faces like there would be if you had a 100-man crew and you only really met like 6 of the sailors. You know, that would feel a little bit more personal than if the crew were smaller. Then the amount of the crew that you have met is a little bit bigger, if you know what I mean. It just helps it to feel a little more personal when there's just not so much a sea of faces. So I knew I wanted a slightly smaller ship, or at least a ship that could be run with a smaller crew, and I ended up settling on the 1600s because there was a type of ship called the galleon. I believe there was also a second type of ship that was during this time period that was a little bit smaller and could be run with a smaller crew, but I cannot remember off the top of my head what it is. I actually had a super helpful book from the library that had like 3D models of a bunch of ships from like the Roman times to like when steam-powered ships came into existence, and like then World War II, and you know, like the whole spectrum. But I have not had that book for a very long time. It has since returned to the library where it belongs, and I don't have it to reference during this video. But anyway, I chose the galleon, and I decided on the 1600s consequently. For reference purposes, it is believed that the Mayflower, I believe, was a galleon or similar ship. And I was able to use the Mayflower as a reference piece, which was very helpful because there wasn't as much information, I feel like, on sailing in the 1600s as there is on the 1700s. The 1700s, I feel like, are more popular from a sailing history standpoint because that's where a lot of the pirate stories that we are familiar with take place. And so the fact that I didn't have that more popular time period kind of at my disposal made where having something like the Mayflower was really useful, because I could glean bits of information from research on that, on like, you know, how big was the crew, you know, what was life like, what did they eat, what did they drink, where did they sleep, stuff like that. Bits and pieces from that, from like an actual ship in the 1600s, were really helpful for me during the process. Aside from that, I also, of course, liked the fashions, and it worked. The 1600s worked with the story, and that's what I ultimately needed, was a time period that worked with the story. And so now that I've told you about how I decided on the 1600s, after I changed my camera battery because it's blinking at me and I don't want it to die in the middle of a sentence, I will tell you about how I incorporated the research that I had done into the story that I had already crafted. Okay, we are back with a fresh camera battery. So, now I'm going to tell you about how I incorporated what I learned into the draft that I'd already written. Now, I can't remember exactly which draft I was on. It was somewhere around 1 or 2, but I had the story already written and crafted. And like I said earlier in this video, it actually wasn't as difficult to incorporate the historical aspects as, looking back, I would have expected it to be for the story already being written. So, because the story already takes place on a ship, that detail was already there. You know, there were some minor changes I made because we were now on a specific type of ship, you know, and I wanted there to be small details like, you know, oftentimes the captain's cabins were towards the back, or on this deck, or, you know, there was the raised part at the back of the ship called the stern castle. We might, you know, just mention somebody walks over there. Not in a forced way, but just little details here and there that as the reader you might not notice, except that they're helping to immerse you in the world and make it more believable. There were also things like I mentioned in yesterday's video that Ruth's outfit changed drastically as I did more research because I wanted it to be true to the time period, even though the 1600s were a pretty difficult time period for me to find information on a common woman's clothing. There were a lot of changes in the 1600s. You know, you had like the Elizabethan clothing at the beginning, but I wanted more like a piece of clothing, more like what the Pilgrims would have worn, the Puritans, you know, just a more regular, basic, everyday outfit. As you can see, you know, her outfit's not super fancy or anything, but it reflects the time period she's in, and that was challenging. The men's clothing was actually easier than the ladies' clothing, if I remember right. But there was that, and I just included details about the clothing and things like that anywhere that you would normally have a description of a person's outfit in the story, and that was pretty simple to include. I did go through, some rounds of tweaking things and, making it exactly how I wanted it to be, especially for the main character's outfits, but that was pretty simple too. And there was another aspect to the research that I did that was really just me going through and adding it for fun because I enjoyed it and I felt like the reader would also enjoy it, and that is sailing jargon. Making sure that the sailors were using actual sailing terminology, and that was an absolute blast. I actually did a bunch of research on the internet for sailing terminology, some of which is still in use today. I don't know how much of what's in use today made it into the book, but some of what I researched is still in use today. In fact, I started to print off the Wikipedia nautical dictionary, but with some advice from my parents, I decided that would use up a lot of paper, and honestly, I don't think it would have been very easy to use anyway, because it was just, a regular standard pieces of paper. But I actually now do own an actual nautical dictionary. It's about this size, and some of the terms in it are more recent, more for the ships that came later that had engines and stuff like that. And it was just a lot of fun to be able to be oh, that's the perfect word for that part of the story, or that's the perfect phrase for the captain to use over here, or the perfect thing to describe what he's telling them to do with the sails over in this part. So that was a lot of fun. I feel like it really helped to create a more believable world and make the sailors more believable. And I also included for you guys a dictionary in the back of the terms that they use, so that way if there's ever a term that you're reading along and you just like to know more specifically what it means, you can flip back there and check it out. And that was a lot of fun. I thought that was very cool. I entertained the idea of using an asterisk system instead, having an asterisk next to a word and then having it defined at the end of the chapter, but I decided that would be more confusing than just having one spot to flip to at the very back if you see a word you don't recognize. So that was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed doing the research for how to make the sailors sound like sailors, and it was a lot of fun. So those are really the three main aspects of the research that I did and how I included it, the ship, the fashion, and the sailing jargon. But there were, of course, other aspects. Some of the smaller aspects include things like their exact locations throughout the different parts of the book, and then there were also some subtle, manners and behavior type of things that my mom helped me work with in the editing process. I mentioned this, I think, in one of the other videos. I can't remember exactly which one. It might have been yesterday's, might be one that's coming out, that there were a couple of places where something Ruth said or did came off as flirty because of the historical context. Now, it was something that if a person was just being, outgoing and friendly and saying that today, it wouldn't come off as flirtatious. But because of the historical context and specifically, everything that was going on, it came off as flirty because of those things. So we tweaked it so that, it wouldn't read that way, because when you're working in a historical setting, you do have to be aware that there are some things that would be totally fine today that would come off in a totally different way, 400 years ago or whatever. So there were smaller things like that that we also tweaked throughout the book. But in general, the process of making the historical setting a integral part of the story when I had already written it wasn't as jarring or as difficult as I suppose I would have expected. And I'm really happy with the result. I feel like it's very coherent, and it feels like it was in that setting all along. And for most of the process of me writing this book, it has been in that setting, but at the very beginning, I didn't know what setting I wanted it to be in, so it was pretty vague and there weren't any specific locations. But now there are specific places they are and specific cultural aspects like the clothing that reflect the time period, the 1600s, and really bring the story to light in that way for you guys, my readers. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you've been inspired or just fascinated by the process that it took for me to get all the research done for my novel and to incorporate it into my story. And if you did enjoy this video, please give it it a thumbs up and subscribe so that you don't miss any of the videos that will be coming out during release. I am so excited that tomorrow Ruth's story is going to be out in the world where y'all can read it, and I'm so excited to see where the Lord takes her book and my writing in the future. And thank you to everyone who's been so amazing and supportive and really encouraged me and inspired me as I have been working to put out Free into the world. I will see you in the next video, and don't forget, tomorrow is release day. Bye-bye.